So you've pulled together a literature review, and you've done interviews with managers, and you've done surveys of managers and so on, and created this report. And based on this report, we've created a management skills assessment that's available now, and Mindtools can help organizations measure management capability and give individualized feedback to managers on how they do that. But then the next thing that we've done off the back of that is then start thinking about how we can take those insights into our product development for building better managers, which is the reason that this report has the title that it does. And so you and I, Anna, have been working a lot recently with our in-house content team to develop what we call skill bites. And we've spoken about skill bites on this podcast before, but I'm going to do a quick reminder for anyone who doesn't remember when I wanged on for 30 minutes about skill bites. So a skill is something that you need to practice. You can't just read a piece of content and become skilled. So we have created a feature within the Mindtools platform called Skill Bites that starts by assessing a user's current capability. So those are using the kind of assessments that Anna's been talking about. Then it gives them a small amount of content on a weekly basis that gives them a practical technique to practice aligned with the assessment. And at the end of each session, the user is asked to record a personal commitment for how they will apply that technique in their context. And at the start of the following session, we remind them of their commitment and ask them to reflect on how they got on. So all of this should sound quite familiar based on what Anna just said around what we know works in a management development context. So skill bites incorporate spaced learning, retrieval practice, behavioral nudges, and then reflective moments to build skills over time. And what we've done off the back of Anna's research is create one of these skill bites for every one of those 12 capabilities. So a user can identify gaps in their existing capability, and then we give them a way to fill that gap and develop in those areas. The interesting piece is that the insights team, led by Gent and Anna, have been working with their content team to create these 12, and it has proven far more challenging than we expected. So I just presented that like it was the easiest thing in the world, and we all know what works in management development. But the challenge has been that the skills being developed are not necessarily about things that you can do on your own. As we said last week, being a good manager is predominantly about how you interact with others. So Anna, I thought maybe you could share just a couple of examples of the sort of the process that we went through. And maybe you could chat a bit about the coaching skill bite in particular. So how do we measure it, and then how do we develop coaching capabilities?
Sure. I mean, Russ, you set that up like you didn't enjoy the collaboration, but from my side, I had a great...
It was the most fraught conversation you and I have ever had, Anna, was that coaching skill bite.
It was. Yeah, it was. But in a great way.
Constructively conflict.
We came to a very good point, I think, at the end. So the reason Ross and I were so sort of challenged by this particular skill bite coaching was because it didn't really so my research and the background that I had looked into for developing the assessment for coaching didn't quite align with what we would all necessarily think about when we think about coaching. So we think about coaching, we think about quite the practical ways in which managers coach their employees, or even employees coach other employees. And I think that when we think about those practical things, we think about, okay, you need to be good at providing constructive feedback, or setting clear goals, or assisting people with sort of time management, or making decisions about, what sort of development opportunities they might go for. But actually, the research in this topic is much more about the sorts of foundational skills you need in order to be a good manager and to do all of those practical things. So there's almost like another layer to it. So coaching, as we all agree, and I'm sure you'd be hard pressed to find a business now that doesn't accept coaching is an important part of what the business should be in the culture. We do know that very few managers, sort of around 70% of managers, say that they do not receive training on coaching. So they don't know how, they're not trained in how to do it effectively. But coaching is about maximizing employee potential. It's not only about correcting poor performance. It's not a one-time thing. It is part of culture. And when it's done right, managers should be able to, I guess, utilize everyday, ordinary kind of experiences and opportunities in order to develop their people. It shouldn't be bound to one-on-one interactions that managers have to carve time out for. It should be for all interactions, even across the team. The research looking at coaching specifically from sort of a manager skills perspective will tell us that coaching is the most effective when it is embedded in a culture rather than managed as a series of events, and that the relationship between managerial coaching and things like employee engagement, for example, is directly mediated by culture, which means that when managers adopt a coaching mindset, cultures will flourish, and when that happens, employees are more engaged at work. So they go very hand in hand. Coaching and culture are to me, in many ways, sort of inseparable for that reason. So through the research, I kind of settled on a researcher who had done quite a lot of sort of looking into this as a topic, had done quite a lot over the years, called McLean. And with the colleagues Park and Yang, they decided and quite confidently agreed that effective coaching is about mindset and it's about foundational skills. So we decided, after being convinced by the data that they have produced, that this is absolutely the right approach to be going down. So they highlight the sorts of things that managers need in order to do coaching well. So being able to have open communication with your people allows you to build the right sorts of interpersonal relationships and rapport that then is necessary for managers to influence other people. You need to have a good relationship to be able to do that. The second was about having sort of a more team approach, so a very sort of people focused approach. Managers treating their employees as partners, like sort of respecting their ideas, helping them to make better decisions through discussions, empowering them to do so, real sort of collaborative element. They also look at, again, from a person sort of oriented perspective, they look at how by acknowledging individual needs and not focusing so much on just sort of the business and its outcomes, you are absolutely tapping into that sort of, empowerment, but allowing them to sort of also acknowledge that, my needs matter, and that should be part of the decision of things that happen in my future and the future that then goes on to benefit the business. And I think we talked about this last week, Ross, when we said that management has gone from being sort of more, I guess, transactional and traditional to more about people. And that is absolutely the right direction, for management to move into. And, managers behave more like leaders now than they have done in the past. And so, again, that person-oriented approach is very important. But there's also other skills, like, the accepting ambiguity is one of them, which is about helping employees become more adaptive, consider multiple perspectives when they're making decisions, to embrace uncertainty, things that we have to do in complex and fast-changing businesses, which
Creative
many
conflict,
of us
I think, was one of them, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It was something that we, a
yeah.
very meta point that came up while we were looking at it.
But it's things that these are all skills. I think most people would say these, I wouldn't necessarily have thought of them in the sort of context of coaching, but actually when you sort of talk about them and say, well, if you can do all of this as a manager, then all the stuff that we do think about when we think about coaching becomes so much easier, because you're building the right sorts of relationships and cultures in order for coaching to kind of really work. And I think that's the point. And so there is a final part to the research that does sort of look at more of the kind of traditional coaching things we would expect, which is about developing people. So, providing suitable learning resources, giving feedback, setting goals, asking good questions, role playing, again, is a good example of that. So there are those elements in there too. But I think what's different about this as an assessment is we're not just talking about the sort of the everyday activities that you would need to do to be a good coach, but we're actually tapping into the real skills, the things that make coaching effective and make sure it works, that really matter.